Today, we're going to crack open the user's manual for the most powerful and, let's be honest, most complicated machine we'll ever own, our brain. We're going to dig into the science of psychology to find some real, practical tools to help us, actually master our own minds.
I mean, if you ever felt that, you've got this incredible supercomputer right between your ears, but sometimes it just feels like it's working against you, not for you. So what if you could finally understand its operating system?
Okay, does any of this sound familiar? That last-minute cram session before a big test. Or you study for hours, but then your mind just goes completely blank during the exam. Or maybe you feel like you know the material, but the questions on the test feel like they're from another planet. Yeah, those are the exact moments that make you wish you had that manual.
Well, believe it or not, there's a science dedicated to understanding exactly these kinds of problems. And that science is psychology. And look, it's not just about what you see in the movies, lying on a couch. It's about understanding the nuts and bolts of how we think, how we feel, and why we do the things we do. So what is it really? Well, at its core, psychology is the scientific study of our behavior and all the mental stuff going on behind the scenes. And that word, scientific, is absolutely key. This isn't about guesswork or gut feelings. It's a real discipline, built on hard evidence and a ton of critical thinking.
And psychology has four big goals. First, it tries to describe what's going on. Then it wants to explain. Why is it happening? What's the root cause? Once you can do that, you can start to predict when it might happen again. And finally, and this is the really cool part, the goal is to change things, to bring about better outcomes. This is where we actually get to use that user manual.
Right, so psychology didn't just pop into existence. It was built piece by piece over time by some really brilliant people who are asking the big questions about what makes us tick. Let's meet a few of these pioneers.
Our little tour starts way back in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany. This is where a guy named Wilhelm Wundt, who we now call the father of psychology, opened the world's very first psychology laboratory. And this was a huge deal. It was the moment psychology officially went from just being a bunch of philosophical questions to a real, hands-on science. Meanwhile, over in the US, you had William James, the father of American psychology, and he took things in a much more practical direction. He wasn't so interested in just taking the mind apart to see the pieces. He wanted to know about its function. How does our mind actually help us adapt and survive out in the real world? This was a game changer, really pushing psychology towards things we can actually use.
Then you get the behaviorists, like B.F. Skinner, and his whole thing was focusing on what we can actually see and observe, our behavior. Skinner showed how our actions are basically shaped by rewards and consequences. And I mean, this idea has had a massive impact on, well, everything, from therapy for phobias to how we teach kids in school.
And this stuff isn't just for textbooks. Psychology can literally change the world. Just look at the groundbreaking work of Kenneth and Mamie Clark. They used dolls to show the really damaging psychological effects of segregation on children. And their research, it became a key piece of evidence in the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that helped end segregation in schools. That's powerful.
Okay, so we've seen that psychology can be incredibly powerful, but how do they actually know all this? What's the secret sauce that separates a real psychologist from, say, a psychic or someone reading your horoscope? Well, it all comes down to the method. And this is a really important point. Psychology is all about evidence, not just belief. The famous magician James Randi put this to the ultimate test. He had a standing offer of $1 million for anyone who could prove they had psychic powers under proper, controlled scientific conditions. And you know what? After decades, that prize was never claimed. That right there is the difference between real science and pseudoscience.
So, instead of relying on hunches, psychologists use the scientific method. It's a whole process. It starts with a question, which leads to a testable prediction, what we call a hypothesis. Then they'll design a study, collect data, and analyze it. But it doesn't just stop there. The really important part is that they publish their findings so other scientists can look at it, critique it, and even try to do the same experiment themselves to see if they get the same results. It's this slow, careful process that builds up our scientific knowledge.
Now, within that scientific method, psychologists have a few main tools in their toolbox. First, there's descriptive research. That's basically just observing and recording what's happening out in the real world. Then you have correlational research, which looks for relationships between things, super helpful for making predictions. And finally, there's the experimental method. This is really the gold standard for figuring out cause and effect. And as you can see, each one has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, let's zoom in on correlational research for a second, because this is where a lot of people get tripped up. It's awesome for finding patterns and seeing if two things are connected. It helps us make predictions. But there's one giant catch you have to remember.
Think about a superstition, right? Like knocking on wood for good luck. Someone might say, hey, I knocked on wood and then I got the job. So a correlation exists. But did the knocking actually cause them to get the job? No way. And this is probably the most important rule to learn. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things happen at the same time, it doesn't mean one made the other one happen.
Okay, so we've gone through some of the history and the science behind it all. But now for the part you've been waiting for, let's actually put this stuff to work. How can we use all these insights as a real user manual for our own brains?
All right, one of the single most powerful tools psychology has ever given us is this idea of mindset. And it really comes down to two paths. On one hand, you've got the fixed mindset. That's where you believe your talents are just fixed. You either have it or you don't. So you avoid challenges and give up pretty easily. But then there's the growth mindset. This is the belief that you can grow and improve. You see challenges as chances to get better, and you understand that effort is how you get to mastery.
You know, the research on how to learn effectively is crystal clear. And honestly, it might blow your mind. A lot of the stuff we all do, like highlighting our textbooks or just rereading our notes over and over, turns out there's some of the least effective ways to study. The science says the best methods are things like distributed practice, which just means spreading your studying out over time, not cramming, and practice testing, so constantly quizzing yourself. And it works because spacing things out helps your brain lock in the memories, and forcing yourself to recall information actually makes those brain connections stronger.
Here's a great example. Just take a look at all these pennies. Can you pick out the one that's a real, actual penny? Most people can't. And think about that. We've seen thousands and thousands of pennies in our lives. So why can't we do it? Because we've only ever been passively exposed to them. We never sat down and actively tried to learn the details. And it's the exact same thing with that textbook chapter you just skimmed. Just looking at the words isn't the same as actually learning.
So, when you boil it all down, it really comes to this. Sure, our genes and our environment play a role in who we are. But the one thing you have almost total control over is your attitude. That desire to learn and to change, that has to come from you. Psychology can't just magically fix you. What it can do is give you the tools to fix yourself.
So there you have it, a little peek inside the user's manual for your brain. We've seen how the way we think about our own abilities, our mindset, and how we actually go about learning can make a world of difference. So the only real question left is, what are you going to change?